Joyful. Good, I like to hear that. I want to remind you to re-up your joy. Rejoice. I'm in a joyful, little subdued. Just came from Mom this weekend. We had lunch with her yesterday, and as I've shared before, she's living in the eternal present. As soon as anything leaves, she forgets it. So as soon as we step out of the room, she doesn't know we were there. So you have to live with her in the moment. She did have a fall this week, and she's bruised all side of her face, both eyes, and all the way down the side of this neck. She's had 4 TIA episodes this week, one that lasted 30 minutes that she was not with them. And so, we were talking yesterday to the hospice nurse, and she was saying, do you understand this progression? Do you understand that this is telling us that her time is short? And we do. We understand that. And as we were sitting at lunch with her, we had a table to ourselves. And it was just sitting there looking at her with the realization, very, very soon, you're going to be standing face to face with the Lord. And I'm not, all things being equal. And appreciate, Ethan, you leading that first song that you led about there's a stirring deep inside me. Could this be the time that I see my Lord face to face? I am incredibly joyful right now because Mom and Dad both had a very, very strong relationship with God through Christ Jesus. And, that's the reason I'm standing here before you today in the role that I am. It's because they're example. The greatest joy, the greatest gift that you can give to your family is to be faithful to the Lord. Because not only is it a light in this life, it is their hope in your passing and their joy in your passing, because they know what God has prepared for you and what you're walking into. And so I appreciate your encouragement and prayers, and there's no timetable on those things, but we do know that her time on this earth is coming to an end, and that means she gets to go to her reward, and that is awesome. Charlotte's parents had their children on the college plan. And what that means is her older brother's 5 years older, and she has another brother that's 5 years younger. So they could pay for each one to go through college, save up a little bit, pay for the next one to go through college, etc. Her younger brother, as I mentioned before, Philip Evans, one of the finest men I've ever met in my life. I want you to know a little bit about him, because I'm going to start off with him as an example, and it would embarrass him to death to know that I was doing this. But he sells agricultural products, mainly fertilizers and chemicals, and has done that since college. And has been very successful at it. His supervisor was meeting with the CEO, and they were doing yearly evaluations of employees. And in meeting with them about Philip's situation, he ended up sharing with Philip what he had shared, talking about his supervisor, what he had shared with CEO of the corporation, all that, very, very large worldwide corporation. And the beginning of his blurb about Philip was, integrity's name is Philip Evans. And Phil was sharing that with me as the greatest thing that he thought somebody could say about him. And I can agree to it totally. Philip graduated from Arkansas State University. He had a degree in agriculture, business, and economics. And when he graduated, one of the most severe recessions was taking place in our country. And he couldn't buy a job. And he just took a job. It was actually working at a farmer's co-op, and he was basically sales. While he was working there, and remember, his name is Integrity, according to his own boss. As he was working there, folks would notice. And there was a vice president of corporation in Little Rock that learned of Philip. And he just walked into the store one day and asked to meet with him, sat down and talked with him, and he said, I would like for you to come and move your family to Little Rock from Jonesboro, move your family to Little Rock, and I want you to become my protege. I'm vice president, my time, I'm coming toward retirement, and I have chosen you that I want you to be my successor. Well, as you can imagine, it blew him away. I mean, that he's bypassed so many steps, but this whole, and he wasn't preparing himself to be that. He was just doing the best that he knew to do at what he was doing, and because of what he brought to his position, it was seen, and he was chosen. And it pretty much established him on a track of success that has been through his whole life. But in an industry that changes so much and people are in and out, we were talking just a couple of days ago, and he was saying he believes his longevity is God, but secondly, the integrity, and he mentioned that word that was taught by my mom and my dad to me about, when you do a job, you're working for God, all of those kinds of things. So very much a success story. And I want you to hear his story because it's going to be very similar to the way that God chooses people. He will reach down past all David's brothers and everyone else, and he will find this little shepherd boy, and he will say, that's the one. I want us to talk this morning about leadership succession because we don't talk about that a lot, but that's God's way of passing the mantle. And that's what we are going to be talking about, the mantle of responsibility, leadership, whatever you want to call it. God sees to it that that mantle is passed. Everyone who leads holds the hands of those who went before and holds the hands of those who will come after them. It is a succession of responsibility, and that's what gives it, if done well, that's what gives it the security and gives us the security that God is providing for us and taking care of it. The challenge with that, what I want you to see through this message today is God's way of choosing that succession is not our way, typically. He chooses people that are opposite of what we would choose. And I want to give as evidence of his success, compare that to the succession that Israel chose when they got kings. We want a king. And so what happens is kings pass power to their children, they pass it to their children, and you have a human succession, and look what happened. The destruction of the northern kingdom and ultimately the southern kingdom. Through that succession, it was not chosen by God. Now, God allowed it, God tolerated it because they had basically rejected him, but he warned them, what's going to happen, this is going to lead you to destruction because this is not how I choose succession of leaders. So I want us to look at the relationship between Moses and Joshua, but particularly between God and Joshua. God has chosen Joshua long before he knows that. And I think nowhere in here did Joshua feel capable. But that's okay, because as we're going to see, his capability did not come from Joshua. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us. Go out, fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And Joshua did as Moses told him, and he fought against Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. So it came about when Moses held his hands up that Israel prevailed. When he landed his hands down, Amalek prevailed. Moses' hands were heavy. And they took stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. Thus his hands were steady until sunset. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. And the Lord said this to Moses. Now notice this. Write this, and he said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. He's acknowledging the leadership of Moses, but he's passing from him. We're getting this guy ready. To some degree, I think Moses understood that. I don't think that Joshua did. Joshua was dedicated to Moses. I'm not saying he wasn't dedicated to God. That was his dedication to God. And we're going to see a little bit about how that relationship played out. But what I want you to see in this is Joshua was Moses' military hand. Moses was not a military leader. And Joshua obviously is very good at it. And so he's the general, if you will, of the army. He's the leader of the army. And Moses does not lead them into battle. It's Joshua. But I want you to see that he's also a protege who Moses is going to mentor. Guys, if you see in the background, that's a mantle. The maroon-looking thing, that's a mantle being passed. This is Elijah and Elisha passing a mantle from one to the other. And with that went responsibility, power, and all of those kinds of things. God's leadership has always been by succession. And it starts with him. Now the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and remain there, and I will give you the stone tablets and the law and the commandments which I have written for their instruction." So Moses arose with Joshua, his servant. And Moses went up to the mountain of God. But to the elders he said, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a legal matter, let him approach them." And Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand. Tablets that were written on both sides. They were written on one side and the other, and the tablets were God's work, and the writing was God's writing engraved on tablets. Now when Joshua heard the sound of the people as they shouted, he said to Moses, "This is the sound of war in the camp." But he, Moses, said, "It's not the sound of the cry of triumph, nor is it the sound of the cry of defeat, but the sound of singing I hear." And it came about as soon as Moses came near the camp, and he saw the calf and the dancing, Moses' anger burned, and he threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. So God calls Moses. Moses takes with him Joshua. Now we don't know how far Joshua goes in this process, very possibly to the foot of the mountain. And he leaves there, but he's with Moses when Moses is coming back. And Joshua hears this uproar coming from the people. Being a warrior, his first response is, this is war cries, or this is war celebration. And Moses is listening, and this is before they've gotten there and seen them. And Moses is listening and saying, no, that's not war cry. These people are reveling. And before they even get there, he knows what's going on. But what I want you to see is the set apart of Moses is the set apart of Joshua. He left everybody else there. And Moses apparently knew he was going to be gone for a while, because he said, if you have any legal matters, bring them up with Aaron or Hur, and we're going to be gone. But he took Joshua, his servant, with him. Joshua is being prepared for something he does not even yet know is going to be his responsibility. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses returned to the camp, his servant, Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. So when they got back, he wouldn't go home. He's going to stay where Moses is. You understand, amazing things are going on. Amazing things have happened at the mountain and all of that. He's not going home. And this sounds so much like a very, very dedicated servant. So a young man ran and told Moses and said, Eldad and Medad, prophesying in the camp. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses from his youth, answered and said, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his spirit upon them. And Moses returned to the camp, both he and the elders of Israel. Look at the dedication this man had to Moses. These are the names of those who Moses sent out to spy out the land. But Moses, called Hoshea, son of Nun, Yeshua. He changed his name. Now what's interesting about this is, even though he changed his name, before that, he's still called Joshua when the account is given. When Moses writes about, he calls him Joshua. He doesn't call him by his given name up until the time that he changes. He doesn't call him like Abram and then Abraham. We're just told here that the name that we know him by was changed. Now I want you to understand the significance of those names. Hoshea means salvation. Jehoshua means the Lord is salvation. Now, up until this time, he's acting as kind of the redeemer in terms of leading them to war, those kinds of things. But what Moses is doing is changing the focus here. When you change a name in Hebrew, it's significant. It's a new start. It's a new beginning. It's a total change of vector. There are 12 spies going in. Moses only changed the name of one of them. And he changed him to the name that's going to be the same name that we know as Jesus in Hebrew. See, Joshua and Jesus are the same name. Now, they came to us in different ways. So one came through Greek, one came through Latin in translation of Scripture, but they're the same name, salvation. According to the Talmud, Jewish leaders believed that Joshua changed the name to protect him from the influence of the 10 spies. That God's going to be our salvation. God's going to save us when we go over there. And when these spies come back and say, oh, you know, they're huge people and it's scary and all of those things, that Moses, by premonition, knew that there was going to be tremendous challenge, and so he changed his name. That's what the Jewish leaders believe. As I mentioned, Joshua, which is anglicized through Greek, and Jesus, which is anglicized through Latin, are the same name. This was a significant name change. Changing his name changed his worldview and changed his vector. Why are you sharing all this with us? Well, I'll get to this more in a moment. But what I want to challenge us with, as the people of God, dealing especially in a time of transition of passing the mantle, I want us to determine to, in the future, be more determinate in this process. You see, God is choosing leaders from childhood, and he's setting them on a vector, okay? That's what he's developing them toward. And rather than, when it comes time of leadership transition, rather than looking around and saying, well, have we got anybody we can turn to? That all along we have been developing that. All along we have been watching for who is God developing. Please remember, we don't choose leaders, God does. If we choose them, we're in trouble. We're going to have kings just like in Israel. We've got to follow God's plan in this. We've got to follow his design about how this process is to be played out. We'll be talking about that more next week. We've also got to follow the people that he chooses. And we can see them among us if we're watching for that. Moses is spending a lot of time with Joshua. Jesus spent a lot of time with the 12, almost devoting himself totally to them to prepare them. He's mentoring them purposefully. It's not by accident. It's by design. And I want to suggest to you, I want to challenge you that we take on this mantle of doing likewise. And I'll make that clear in just a moment, hopefully. So the lessons that we can learn from this is God had chosen Joshua. That's why it was successful. That's why it worked. Because God knew Joshua. He knows the hearts of every person in this room better than you and I ever will. He's moving in the lives of people in ways that you and I see or don't see. But he's doing that toward a purpose. God understands churches are going to need leadership. And so he's preparing those because they don't just show up overnight. He does that purposefully. And what I want to challenge us with is the idea of watching for that purposefully. Watching among us of the leaders that God is developing, because we don't make them. Now, we can equip them, but we don't make them. And we don't choose them. He does. What we do is acknowledge the choices that God has made. So God chose Joshua. Moses mentored Joshua since his youth. And you see this over and over and over and over. Samuel and Eli and on and on. People dedicate themselves and they're purposefully brought up. But look what happened with Samuel and Eli and their own sons. You see, they couldn't pass it to their own kids. And had they, it would have been a horrible, horrible mess. When time for transition came, he was ready. He just didn't know it. Guys, when we start talking about God's descriptors of elders and deacons particularly, and their wives, one of the things that we're going to look at is the notion of desire. And I want you to know there's a tremendous difference between desiring the task and ambition for the task. Incredibly different. And it's so important that we understand that, because I've been in situations where men actually ran for elder. And we didn't have an election, but I think you understand what I mean. They were ambitious. What I want you to see in Joshua, and what you're seeing in you see it in Gideon, you see it in David, all of them, men of faith, but not me, not me. I'm the least of my clan, and on and on and on. And the same with Joshua. How do we know that? Because in Joshua chapter 1, 4 times he's told, don't be afraid, don't be timid, be strong, be courageous. You don't do that 4 times to somebody who's already strong and courageous. You do that to someone who's used to following in the footsteps of a man he has tremendous respect for, but I could never do that. And the truth is, he can't do that. He can't be Moses. God doesn't want another Moses. Remember last week? We don't replace people. We replace roles. Because you can't replace people. We can't replace Larry. Wouldn't try. We can't replace Kevin. Wouldn't try. But we can replace the role of leadership. That's what God and Moses, whether he understood it or not. I think there was a point, I could show you that point in which God's beginning to reveal to him his plans for Joshua. But Joshua knew he couldn't replace Moses. And what that brings is humility. And humility is the foundation of godly leadership. Humility is the opposite of human leadership. Because godly leadership is service. You can't have service without humility. So anytime God calls a man of integrity, he's overwhelmed by the responsibility. And he becomes like that buzzard singing about bringing home, in the cartoon, bringing home I'm bringing home a baby bumblebee. And if you remember, that character was like, oh no, not me, oh no. That's the attitude. Because his power can't come from himself. His authority can't come from himself. His leadership can't come from himself. 4 times he's told in Joshua chapter 1, be strong and courageous. Even one time in that last verse of the chapter, the nation told him that. Joshua, just be strong, be courageous. Don't be afraid, because God has chosen you. Leadership is a succession, not a reinvention. It's not a restart. It's not starting over. It's a process, not an event. The problem is, every few years we have an event. What's the event? We're going to install elders, or we're going to appoint elders, or we're going to anoint elders, whatever you feel comfortable calling it. And so it looks like there's an event, then we stop, and then we have another event, and then we stop. That's not the way it works. It's not the way it should work. And so what I want us to be is more overt about a process that is ongoing. To be overt about it and to be aware of it. That leadership is a succession. It's a process. In my history in the church, we begin to seek out leaders when we need them. In my history of the church, when it came time for a need for eldership, let's look around and see if we got any people. Is there anybody out there that's qualified? Like, oh my goodness, we got to find a plumber. I don't know one. Do you know? I mean, and I'm being absurd here, but that's kind of the image it's sometimes presented. I've never known of an elder or deacon mentoring ministry, where we take young men and say, we think you may have the qualities of leadership. We want to mentor you in that. Now, what you do with it is between you and God. But at the very least, you're going to end up a spiritual leader. Whether you choose to do that, whether you desire to do it as appointed by the church, or you just do that because you're a Christian. You're going to be a better father if you set this goal. You're going to be a better husband. You're going to have a better family. Your life, you're going to do better in your life will go better if you will set some personal goals. Because brothers and sisters, when we get to look at God's description of leaders, it's not about uniqueness, it's about spiritual excellence. And that should be the goal of every one of us. Male, female, young, old, whatever. The only leadership training I have ever seen, and by training I mean equipping, just like that boss took Philip under his wing, and for several years he prepared him to become his replacement. Very high in the echelon of the company. This was done by design. And this guy had a vision for, I want to do this over years with Philip. The only leadership training I've witnessed when I was young was training boys to lead in assemblies. I beg your pardon. Leadership in assembly is not leadership. It's a form. I understand when someone leads a prayer, they're leading us in prayer. That is not leadership of the church. That's leadership of functions in an assembly. And I have no problem with that, and I have no problem with preparation. But where is the same kind of equipping for men and women to be men and women of leadership of God? Where does that take place? And I think in my history, it's been by osmosis. God doesn't work through osmosis. He works through passing the mantle deliberately. Even deacons are to be tested. I want to ask you, look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 10. Let those also first be tested, then let them serve as deacons if they are above reproach. What deacon test, if I were to ask you, how do you test a deacon? What would be your answer? Some of you would say we need to start with an intelligence test. How do you test a deacon? Well, I don't know, they just kind of show up. No, they don't. In order for God to pass the mantle, there has to be some preparation. Did God prepare them? Yes. But we're also very responsible to mentor, to equip. And God has given us the word to be able to do that. And it totally equip anybody to service. We need to make the Moses-Joshua transition now. We're doing that. We have just begun the process through these lessons. Now, this process has already been going on. So we need to make a Moses to Joshua transition right now for the leadership of this congregation into the coming year. But we also need to be preparing Joshua's for future leadership. And as I'm looking through this room, I see men and women that I believe are endowed by God with leadership qualities and leadership capabilities. And they ooze it. They don't know it because it hasn't been identified. The mantle hasn't been laid before them. The challenge hasn't been given. You need to grow up to become an elder. You need to grow up to become a teacher. You need to grow up to become a preacher. You need to grow up to be, and whether or not you do that formally, you're going to be a better Christian, because all that is about pursuing Christian excellence. I want you to be reading the qualifications of elders and deacons over the next several weeks. And I want you to ask yourself, how many of these apply to me simply because I'm a Christian? Let me cheat for you. Almost all of them. The difference is they're set as examples of that for you to follow, not say, oh, well, I'm not an elder, so. They're pursuing Christian excellence. And I want to challenge you too. I want to challenge young men in this room. I want to challenge young women in this room. I want to grow up pursuing excellence. Now, what God chooses to do with that, that's His choice. What He leads me into, I will do whatever. But in the meantime, I am going to become the most excellent Christian that I can be. And that will open up all kinds of doors to me. Professional doors, relationship doors. It'll open up. You will be a better parent. You will be, and all it is setting out a goal. It's expanding a vision. That if you set your goals on spiritual excellence, if you set your goal on being an elder, an elder's wife, a teacher, no matter what happens with that, you will not have wasted an ounce or a second of time. There's an old adage, shoot for the moon, because wherever you fall, it's going to be a lot further than it would have been if you'd shot any closer. Especially in a time where lack of leadership in our homes, lack of leadership in our nation, lack of leadership in many places in God's own family. Why? Because we're not passing the mantle. We're choosing. Not passing the mantle to whom God has chosen. So I would ask each young man to consider dedicating yourself to the goal of eldership. Every one of you. Well, things might happen in my life that disqualify me. Yeah. And you'll still be the best Christian you can be. And God will use you. I'm very serious. I'm looking at some of you. And I'm asking you to take on the mantle of preparing yourself. And I'm asking the leaders of this congregation to take them under your wing and purposefully mentor them. I would ask each young woman to dedicate yourself to becoming the wife of an elder, or a teacher, or a leader in women's ministry. Doing all things appropriately with the roles that God has established. But don't say, I'm not a man, I can't lead. The question is not whether or not you can lead. The question is where you lead. Because nobody leads everywhere. Present yourselves to the elders and ask them, say, I want to be mentored toward that goal. Take me under your wing. I want to be Joshua to your Moses. And let God decide what He will do with me. As we consider the qualifications for leadership, accept them as descriptions of spiritual excellence. Now, brothers and sisters, when we get there, I want to talk very much about the difference between spiritual excellence and perfection, because they're not the same thing. Spiritual excellence, as we see in the life of David, as we see in the life of Noah, as we see in the life of Moses, is men with feet of clay. Be aware that what may disqualify you in the future so that you can prepare and prevent it. If you see what the qualifications are and you set that as, I want to try to achieve that mantle, I'm going to avoid this and I'm going to avoid that and I'm going to avoid this because those things would disqualify that pursuit. If those disqualifications happen, fine. You're still further down the road. You're still in greater excellence than you ever would have been had you not set before yourself that mantle. This is the highest of human calling. Leadership among God's people, because it's the only one that's eternal. God chooses leaders, we acknowledge them. And I'm going to ask every person in this room, wherever you are in your relationship with God, to step up and say, I want to be the leader that I'm not yet, and I want you to make me into the leader that you would have me be. Everybody leads somewhere. Everybody is being watched somewhere. It may be in your own home, with your own children, which I would say is the most humbling and incredibly powerful leadership opportunity there is, and that's in our own homes. Let God decide where it will be, but you make the decision that it will be. I'm going to ask you to lay your life down and present yourself to God in a new way today, purposefully pursuing the mantle. And let God do with it what he will. You cannot but win. And your spouse will win, and your children will win, and your grandchildren will win, and on, because you will be passing a unique mantle, striving for spiritual excellence. Now, that results from the decision that I want to be a person of spiritual excellence. Do you? Are you living your life in the pursuit of Christ likeness? I want to know Christ and the power of his rising. Everybody wants that. I want to share in his suffering. I want to be conformed to his death. I want the whole Jesus experience. Now that starts with being united with him in baptism if you haven't done that. But if you've done that, now it is the recommission of myself, or commission of myself to a greater degree. Can we help you do that this morning? We're laying a mantle before you. Will you pick it up? Will you allow God to make you be part of the conduit through which he passes his power, his blessings, and his salvation? Can we help you make that calling and election